Sometime in the early 1990s, a river in mid-Wales rose higher than it should have done. It was not a famous flood. It did not make national headlines. There were no photographs that anyone kept. A tributary of the Severn, swollen by Welsh rain, did what Welsh rain eventually teaches every river to do. It found the lowest point, it found the gap, and it went through. The lowest point, on this occasion, was a factory floor in Powys. Inside that building were amplifiers. Not many. This was never a large operation, but each one had been built by hand, tested by ear, designed according to a philosophy that had taken 20 years to refine, and that could not, under any circumstances, be written down in a form that would survive a filing cabinet, let alone a flood. The water did not know any of this. By the time it receded, Ion Systems, the company that had grown from Nytech Audio, which had grown from a converted Bristol workshop, which had grown from 3 engineers who had walked out of one of Britain's most respected electronics firms and decided to do something that nobody had quite done before, was finished. Not wounded, not restructured, finished. Here is what makes that ending strange. In the same period, a second-hand Nytech CTA-252, the amplifier that Richard Hay and his colleagues had designed 15 years earlier in a factory outside Bristol, was selling on the British used market for more than it had cost when new. Collectors were finding them in loft conversions and spare bedrooms. Dealers were turning them away because they sold before they could be listed. The audiophile community, which had moved on to other things, was quietly, persistently moving back. The flood destroyed the factory. The market had already decided the amplifier was irreplaceable. But the real story of Nytech is not the flood. It is the story of what Richard Hay carried out of Arthur Radford's Bristol workshop in 1972, a way of hearing sound that belonged to the age of the valve, translated into the age of the transistor, refined across 2 company names and 3 decades, and ended by the one force that British manufacturing had never learned to argue with. Not a corporation, not a conglomerate, not a government policy or a Japanese competitor or a cost accountant with a spreadsheet. A river in Wales, rising. If you find yourself drawn to stories like this one, the British engineers who built something extraordinary, and the quietly devastating ways those things were lost, then this channel exists for you. Subscribe and stay with us. Bristol, 1946. The war had been over for less than a year. The city was still reading its own damage. The Blitz had taken whole streets in the center, and the rebuilding was years away from completion. But in the workshops and back rooms of a city that had always made things, aircraft components, tobacco machinery, engineering instruments, a different kind of reconstruction was already underway. Arthur Hedley Radford was not a romantic. He was a practical man from a practical city, trained in electronics at a time when electronics meant valves, transformers, and the patient, systematic reduction of distortion to levels that the test equipment of the day could barely measure. He had spent the war years working on communications and military projects, and when peace came, he did what a significant number of British engineers did with the surplus equipment flooding onto the market. He opened a shop, Cabot Radio, on the streets of Bristol. And then, because selling other people's equipment was never quite enough, he started building his own. The first Radford amplifiers were modest. PA systems, workhorse applications, the kind of thing that needed to work reliably in a hall or a factory, rather than sound beautiful in a drawing room. But Arthur Radford had heard what his amplifiers could do at the edge of their range, and he understood something that would take the rest of the British hi-fi industry another decade to fully absorb. That the output transformer, the component that coupled the valve's output stage to the loudspeaker, was where British amplifier design was either won or lost. He was right, and he was better at transformer design than almost anyone else in the country. By 1959, Radford Electronics had moved from PA systems into the hi-fi market, and the reception was immediate. The Radford STA range, STA for stereo amplifier, launched in 1961 alongside the DSM preamplifier, and the Series 3 versions of the STA-15 and STA-25 won critical acclaim that the British audio press, not given to easy superlatives, found difficult to qualify. The distortion levels Radford achieved were so low that the company had to design and build its own test instrumentation to measure them. Standard commercial equipment simply could not read the numbers. At its peak, Radford Electronics operated 4 factories in Bristol, 160 people working in metalwork, painting, transformer manufacture, loudspeaker assembly, printed circuit board production, all of it in-house, all of it under the same Bristolian roof. This was not a cottage industry. It was a serious British engineering operation, and it produced instruments that the professional audio world and the most demanding domestic listeners regarded as among the finest in the world. That was the world Richard Hay walked into in 1969. He had wanted to build fast jets. That is not a metaphor, and not an exaggeration. Richard Hay, born in 1944, had grown up with Barnes Wallis as a boyhood hero, the man who designed the bouncing bomb, the geodetic airframe, the structures that made the Wellington bomber possible. Hay's ambition, leaving Southampton University in 1967 with an electronics degree, had been Hawker or somewhere like it. Speed, aerospace, the application of precision engineering to objects that left the ground. Instead, he went to Truvox. It was not a glamorous beginning, but Truvox gave him something that aerospace never would have: the specific, practical problem of audio electronics at the frontier of what British components could achieve. It was at Truvox that Hay designed and built the first FM tuner in the United Kingdom to use integrated circuits and field effect transistors. In 1967, that was not a minor achievement. It was the leading edge of a technology that was about to reorganize the entire electronics industry, and Richard Hay was already inside it. 2 years later, in 1969, he joined Radford Electronics as chief engineer. He was 24 years old. He was working alongside Arthur Radford, 23 years his senior, Bristol-trained, transformer-obsessed, the man whose distortion measurements required their own test equipment, and Dr. Arthur Bailey, the acoustic engineer whose collaboration with Radford on pentode phase inverter design had produced the circuit at the heart of the STA range. The 3 men worked together on the question that was becoming unavoidable by the end of the 1960s. The valve amplifier was approaching the end of its commercial life, and transistors were coming, and the problem was not whether to make the transition, but how to make it without losing the one thing that made British valve amplifiers worth owning in the first place. That one thing was sound. Specifically, the way a valve amplifier, when driven into its upper operating range, produced a harmonic distortion that was not a flaw in the circuit but a characteristic of it. A warmth, a dimensional quality, a sense of the music occupying physical space rather than being reproduced from a flat plane. Transistor amplifiers measured better. They were quieter, more efficient, cheaper to produce. They did not sound the same. Richard Hay loved valves. He also understood, with the clarity of a trained engineer, that the industry was moving regardless of what he loved. His job, as he came to define it inside Radford's Bristol workshops, was to make the transistor sound like what it was replacing. He worked at Radford for 3 years. By the time he left, in the early 1970s, he had absorbed something that could not be taught directly and could not be written into a specification document: the Radford way of hearing, the understanding that distortion figures on a test bench were not the same thing as musical quality in a room, that the ear was a more demanding instrument than the oscilloscope, that British hi-fi, at its best, was not a measurement exercise, it was a translation. What does it mean to carry a philosophy? Not just a job, not just a skill, but a way of hearing from one generation to the next. Richard Hay was about to find out. In the early 1970s, 3 engineers left Radford Electronics and founded a company they called Nitronics. Richard Hay, Dave Allner, Paul Hamblin, three men who had spent their most formative professional years inside one of Britain's most demanding electronics operations, and who had decided, with the particular confidence of people who know exactly what they are doing, that they could do it on their own terms. The initial brief was not heroic. A Scandinavian distributor, a company called Electrostic, needed an amplifier that would fit inside a specific furniture cabinet. The dimensions were fixed, the aesthetic was fixed, the market was fixed. A music center for the Scandinavian domestic consumer, something that would sit alongside a Gerard turntable on a sideboard and not embarrass the furniture around it. Richard Hay looked at the brief. Then he looked at what was sitting on every office desk in Britain in 1972, the mains-powered desktop calculator, wide as an LP record, festooned with buttons, displaying its output through a window of smoked perspex. And he saw, in that thoroughly unglamorous office object, something that nobody else had seen, an amplifier. Not a metaphor for an amplifier. An actual amplifier, shaped like a calculator, controlled like a calculator, designed to sit on a sideboard the way a calculator sat on a desk, horizontal, accessible, immediate. Hay called it the CTA 252. CTA, Calculator Tuner Amplifier. He built his first prototype from balsa wood models, the way an aerospace engineer might mock up a fuselage section. He was, after all, still partly that person. The CTA 252 launched from Nytech's factory at Chew Magna, a village on the southern edge of Bristol, not a place that announced itself as a center of British electronics manufacturing, in 1975. 25 watts per channel into a 4-ohm load. A built-in FM tuner with 3 panel meters behind a perspex window. Signal strength, tuning, frequency. Sliders for volume, balance, bass, mid-range and treble. 4 FM presets across the top panel, operated by buttons that clicked with the satisfying solidity of office equipment. It looked like nothing else in a British hi-fi shop. It looked, specifically, like something that had wandered in from a different industry entirely and had no business being there. How do you sell an amplifier that sounds like something that no longer exists? That was the question Nytech was about to answer. The answer turned out to be, by making it sound so good that the question became irrelevant. Part B. The sound and the market. To understand what the CTA 252 did, it is necessary to understand one technical decision that Richard Hay made, and why he made it. A valve amplifier, in its classic form, connects its output stage to the loudspeaker through a transformer, a component that matches the high impedance of the valve circuit to the low impedance of the speaker. That transformer is expensive, heavy, and difficult to design well. Arthur Radford had spent his career making transformers better than anyone else in Britain. Richard Hay had spent 3 years watching him do it. Transistor amplifiers dispensed with the output transformer entirely. They were cheaper, lighter, and measured far better on the test bench. They also sounded different, harder, more clinical, less dimensional. The warmth that the transformer had contributed, and that the valve's natural distortion character had reinforced, was gone. Hay's solution was a capacitor-coupled output, a circuit topology in which a large capacitor, rather than a transformer, connected the output stage to the speaker. This was not new technology. What was new was the specific way Hay implemented it. A Class AB push-pull amplifier running off a single supply rail, with careful detail design throughout the signal path, capable of reaching down to 15 Hz, with less than 1 decibel of insertion loss. The circuit ran, as his son Robert later described it, like a valve design executed in solid state. Not because it used valves, it did not, but because the design philosophy behind it, the priorities it expressed, the way it balanced measured performance against musical character, came directly from the workshop of the man who had spent 20 years making British valve amplifiers sound better than anyone else in the world. The ear noticed. In 1980, Hi-Fi Choice, the British magazine that carried more weight with serious domestic listeners than any other publication of its era, awarded the CTA 252 its recommended status. The retail price at that moment was £300. In 1980, £300 represented roughly 10 to 12 weeks of average industrial wages in Britain. It was not an impulse purchase. It was a considered one, the kind of money a working family saved for and thought about, and then committed to with the specific seriousness that the British working and lower middle class reserved for objects they intended to keep for a long time. British hi-fi magazines, not given to commercial enthusiasm, began recommending the Nytech to readers who asked for the best mid-priced amplifier available. Not the most powerful, not the most technically specified, the best. The FM tuner built into the CTA 252, a component that many buyers regarded as a bonus, something free with the amplifier, was quietly attracting its own reputation. Audiophiles who cared specifically about FM reception began describing it, in the letters pages and the listening reports of the period, as among the finest tuners available in Britain at any price. Approximately 30,000 CTA 252s were sold over the course of the model's production run. The run ended in 1982, not because demand had collapsed, not because the amplifier had been superseded, but because the case molds had reached the end of their mechanical life. This is a detail that could only happen in Britain, in a small manufacturing operation, in a decade when tooling investment was not available on the scale that would have allowed replacement. The molds wore out. The run ended. The specific sound that Richard Hay had carried out of Arthur Radford's Bristol workshop, and to translate it into an object shaped like an office calculator, went quiet. For the moment. Somewhere in a dealer's listening room in Liverpool or Sheffield, or Bristol itself. A room that smelled of carpet and valve warmth and the particular silence of an afternoon without customers. A young British buyer sat down in front of the Nytech CTA 252 for the first time. The dealer put a record on. The buyer said nothing. They had not expected to spend £300 that afternoon. They had not expected, walking in off a grey British high street, to hear something that reorganized their understanding of what recorded music was capable of sounding like in a domestic room. They bought it. They kept it for 40 years. The CTA 252 was not the end of Richard Hay's ambition. It was the proof of concept. By the early 1980s, Nytech had moved beyond the calculator amplifier into a range of products that represented something more coherent than a product line. They represented a systematic attempt to bring a specific philosophy of sound reproduction within reach of the British listener who could not afford Naim, could not afford Linn, and had been told, implicitly or explicitly, that the level of musical quality those companies offered was simply not available at the prices Nytech was charging. Hay did not accept that. He had sat in Arthur Radford's workshop and learned that the gap between a mediocre amplifier and an exceptional one was not primarily a question of cost. It was a question of decisions about circuit topology, about component selection, about what the designer prioritized when the measurements pointed in one direction and the ear pointed in another. The CA252, the stripped-down integrated amplifier that replaced the CTA252 after the case molds wore out, removed the tuner, cleaned the signal path, and produced what Nytech themselves described as one of the first genuinely musical British integrated amplifiers at its price point. The sloping front panel, the slider controls, the replaceable phono input board that allowed the owner to switch between moving magnet and moving coil cartridges without returning the unit to the manufacturer. Then came the CPA 602, 60 watts per channel, designed initially as a power upgrade for the CTA 252 owner who wanted more headroom. A companion piece, a second box, a way of expanding a system without replacing it. What it became was something rather different. the most sought-after piece of vintage Nytech equipment on the secondary market today, sought by owners who have heard what it does and cannot find anything modern at its price that does the same thing. The CPA 602 gained its reputation the way the best British hi-fi equipment always gained its reputation, not from advertising, not from endorsements, but from the experience of people who listened to it in rooms and could not subsequently unhear what it had shown them. But the device that crystallized Nytech's ambition most completely was the CXA252. Active loudspeaker systems in which the crossover between bass and treble drive units operates at signal level rather than speaker level, with a separate power amplifier driving each driver directly, had been a preoccupation of the serious British hi-fi community since the early 1970s. Linn and Naim both offered active configurations for their speaker ranges. The results, by universal agreement among those who heard them, were transformative. Tighter bass, cleaner imaging, a sense of resolution and dynamic ease that passive crossovers, with their energy losses and phase complications, could not approach. The problem was price. An active Linn system, LP12, Naim amplification, Linn isobaric speakers in active configuration, cost more than a small car. It was the sound of money as much as the sound of music. The CXA252 was Hay's answer to that problem. An electronic crossover combined with two power amplifier modules in a single box, designed to work directly with Nytech's own CA252 or CTA252 through the pre-amplifier output socket that Hay had built into every Nytech amplifier from the beginning. As if he had always known this moment was coming. Connect the CXA252 to a Nytech integrated and a pair of active capable speakers, and the passive crossover was bypassed entirely. The signal went directly from the electronic crossover to the drive units. The improvement in the listening rooms of the dealers who demonstrated it was not subtle. Nytech partnered with ARC, the acoustic reproduction company, a small Manchester-based speaker manufacturer, to produce loudspeakers designed specifically for active operation. The Nytech ARC system became, in the early 1980s, the entry point to a category of sound quality that had previously required a five-figure investment. It was not cheap, but it was within reach. And that distinction between impossible and merely difficult was, for a generation of British hi-fi buyers who had grown up reading about active systems without ever expecting to own one, the difference that mattered. When four men sit in a room and agree that British hi-fi can do something no one else in the world is doing, is that a movement or is it a moment? Sometime in the early 1980s, four men sat down together. Their names were Richard Hay, Julian Vereker, Ivor Tiefenbrunn, and Bob Stewart. Vereker had founded Naim Audio in Salisbury in 1973. An autodidact, a musician's ear in an engineer's hands, he had built the Nytech integrated amplifier and the Nytech series of power amplifiers into objects of cult devotion among the most demanding British listeners. Julian Vereker believed, with an intensity that could tip into evangelism, that the quality of the amplification was the central variable in the British hi-fi chain, that everything upstream and downstream was served or ill-served by what happened in the amplifier stage. Tiefenbrunn had founded Linn Products in Glasgow in 1973, the same year as Naim. Where Vereker was an amplifier man, Tiefenbrunn was a source man, the founder of the modern argument that the quality of the turntable, not the amplifier or the speaker, determined the ceiling of what a hi-fi system could achieve. The Linn LP12 was the proof. It remained in production. It remained, in the view of the people who owned one, the standard against which all other turntables were measured. Bob Stewart had co-founded Meridian, then still trading as Boothroyd Stewart, in 1977. The company had distinguished itself immediately by making one of the first active loudspeakers designed for the domestic British market. Stewart was a mathematician and an engineer simultaneously, the combination that produces the rarest kind of audio designer, one who can move between the measured world and the hard world without losing confidence in either. And Richard Hay, from Chew Magna, from a factory that made amplifiers shaped like calculators. From 3 years in Arthur Radford's Bristol workshop and a decade of refinement in a building that no one outside the British hi-fi community had ever heard of, these 4 men formed also the Active Loudspeaker Standards Organization. The purpose was technical, to establish common standards for active loudspeaker systems that would allow amplifiers from one manufacturer to work reliably with speakers from another, creating an ecosystem rather than a collection of incompatible proprietary solutions. The ambition behind the purpose was larger, to establish British active loudspeaker technology as a coherent, exportable standard at a moment when British hi-fi was regarded, in the most demanding listening rooms of Europe, Japan, and North America, as the world's most serious domestic audio tradition. Richard Hay was at that table, not as a footnote, not as a technical consultant brought in for a specific problem and thanked at the end, as a founding member, as an equal, as the man who had built the affordable end of the active loudspeaker argument and proved, with 30,000 CTA 252s and the CXA 252 active crossover system, that the philosophy worked at prices that Naim and Linn could not approach. In the regional British hi-fi dealer of the early 1980s, not the London showroom, not the specialist audiophile emporium, but the shop in a Sheffield or Bristol or Liverpool suburb where ordinary working people made serious purchasing decisions, a Nytech ARC active system sat on demonstration alongside equipment that cost 3 times as much. The dealer would put on a record, the customer would listen, and then the customer would ask the question that small British manufacturers lived and died by. Why does this sound better than the other thing, when the other thing costs more? The answer was always the same, because the man who designed it had learned, in a Bristol workshop 20 years earlier, that the question the test bench asked and the question the ear asked were not the same question. And he had spent his entire professional life trying to give the right answer to both, simultaneously, at a price that the British buyer in that suburban dealer could actually pay. That was the peak. The 4 men at the ALSO table. The active systems in the dealers' rooms. The CPA 602 power amplifiers building their quiet, unannounced reputations. The Cardiff buyers and the Sheffield buyers, and the Liverpool buyers taking home something that redefined, privately and without fanfare, what they understood music to be capable of sounding like. It was the high point, and it would not last. What does it take to kill a sound? A corporation, sometimes, a government policy, a production line moved offshore, but a flood? In the late 1980s, Nytech Audio left Bristol. The reasons were not dramatic. There was no hostile acquisition, no boardroom coup, no Japanese competitor undercutting the price list at the point of sale. The small-scale economics of British craft manufacturing had simply become what they always eventually became for companies of Nytech's size and structure. Tight, then tighter, then unsustainable at the existing address. The Bristol manufacturing belt that had nurtured Arthur Radford's operation, the component suppliers, the specialist subcontractors, the trained engineers available for hire within commuting distance of a Somerset village, was not what it had been when Richard Hay first set up in Chew Magna. The company moved to mid-Wales, to Newtown in Powys, a market town on the River Severn's upper reaches, far from the hi-fi shops of London and the audiophile dealers of the English cities, far from the infrastructure of British electronics manufacturing, far from everything except the specific Welsh combination of available industrial space and affordable operating costs that was drawing small British manufacturers deeper into the margins of the country as the decade closed. The company changed its name. Nytech Audio became Ion Systems, The obelisk range arrived, the successor to the CA102, Nytech's earlier attempt at a genuinely affordable British integrated amplifier. The CA102 had been, in the blunt assessment of Nytech's own documentation, a case of penny pinching that had gone too far. The circuit was excellent. The heat management was not. Units overheated, some failed. The reliability reputation that Nytech had spent a decade building sustained damage that took years to repair. Ion Systems addressed it directly. The obelisk corrected the thermal design, tightened the production tolerances, and produced an amplifier that the British hi-fi press received as a return to form. The Obelisk 1, the Obelisk 2, the Obelisk 3, each iteration refining the same fundamental approach that Richard Hay had carried out of Radford's workshop 15 years earlier. Valve thinking, solid-state execution, musical priority over measurement priority. In 1989, Arthur Radford retired. He had been building amplifiers in Bristol since 1946. 43 years. The STA range, the transformer designs that required their own test equipment, the 4 factories, the 160 people. All of it wound down, quietly, as he stepped back. He died in 1993. The thread from his first Bristol amplifier to his retirement ran 43 years and produced some of the finest valve electronics ever made in Britain. Richard Hay had spent 3 of those years inside the tradition and had carried what he learned for the rest of his life. Now Radford was gone, and Ion Systems was alone in Wales, making amplifiers in a market town beside a river with a product range that the most serious British listeners wanted and a financial foundation that remained, as it had always been, slender. The self-inflicted wound. Before the flood, there was the CA102. It is worth dwelling on this, because the CA102 story is the one moment in the Nytech Ion Systems history where the villain was not external, not a competitor, not a policy, not an act of weather, but a production decision made under financial pressure within the company itself. The CA102, marketed as the Obelisk in its Ion Systems iteration, was Nytech's attempt to build a genuinely affordable British amplifier. The circuit was, by any assessment, outstanding. Simple in architecture, expensive in performance, it produced a sound that the reviewers who heard it described in terms that small British manufacturers rarely attracted. The problem was the heat management. The CA102 ran hot. The penny pinching that had kept the price accessible had compromised the thermal design to the point where, in real-world use, in real-world rooms, units failed. Some went up in smoke. Literally, the kind of failure that a buyer does not forget and does not forgive, and that spreads through word of mouth in the audiophile community faster than any advertising can counter. This was Force 4, the craft skills crisis, manifesting not as a loss of trained personnel, but as a loss of engineering discipline under cost pressure. The decision to economize on heat management was taken by people who understood electronics. It was the wrong decision, and its consequences were paid for over years of reputation repair. Ion Systems corrected it. The Obelisk range addressed the thermal failures, replaced the compromised components, and restored the amplifier to what it should always have been. But some dealers had already moved their recommendations. Some buyers had already chosen alternatives. The British hi-fi market of the late 1980s was not short of options, and loyalty, once broken, was difficult to restore. The Obelisk was good enough to rebuild much of what the CA102 had damaged. It was not good enough to undo all of it. And Ion Systems, operating in a Welsh market town, with the overheads of a small precision manufacturer and the income of a niche audio brand, had limited room for error. The room was about to get smaller. The flood. In the early 1990s, a river in Powys rose. This had happened before. It would happen again. The Upper Severn and its tributaries have flooded the low ground of mid-Wales with the regularity of a geological fact, indifferent to whatever human use the low ground has been put to. Newtown has flooded. It has always flooded. The river does not negotiate. The ion systems factory was in the path of the water. What the flood found when it entered that building was not merely inventory. It was not merely equipment that could be replaced with an insurance claim and a purchase order, though the equipment could not, in fact, be easily replaced. The specialist tooling, the test rigs built for specific Nytech and ion circuits, the accumulated physical infrastructure of 20 years of small-scale precision manufacturing did not have catalog equivalents. You could not ring a supplier and order another one. What the flood found and what the flood destroyed was something that has no line on an insurance form. It destroyed the institutional memory. Small manufacturing operations of the Nytech and ion systems type do not run on documented processes. They run on the knowledge that lives in the hands and ears of the people who have been doing the work for 10 and 15 and 20 years. The test engineer who knows, without consulting a document, that a particular batch of capacitors from a particular supplier runs slightly warm and needs a specific adjustment. The assembly technician who has built 400 CPA602 power amplifiers and can identify a solder joint that will fail in 3 years by the way the light catches it. The designer who carries the complete circuit history of every product he has ever made in his head, and who can trace any fault in any unit back to a decision made in a Bristol factory 15 years ago. Richard Hay carried all of that. His colleagues carried portions of it. The flood could not take what was in their heads, but it could take the factory, the tooling, the stock, the infrastructure that a company of ion systems size and capitalization could not replace without external investment that, in the British financial climate of the early 1990s, was not available for small Welsh electronics manufacturers who made amplifiers for Audiophiles. The Hungarian connection materialized. A manufacturer, later to become Heed Audio, stepped in to help keep the Obelisk range in production. The gesture was genuine, and it kept the name alive through the worst of the crisis. It was not enough. Ion systems could not continue. The Obelisk range went to Hungary. The Welsh factory closed. Richard Hay moved to Cheltenham. The lineage was broken, not by a corporation, not by government policy, not by the Japanese import wave that had destroyed so many British instrument manufacturers in the decade before, by water. By a river doing what rivers in Wales do when the rain has been heavy and the ground has been saturated and nobody has yet built the flood defenses that the town will eventually receive. Too late for the things that mattered. The last batch left the building in water-damaged boxes. The test rigs were ruined. The tooling was gone. 20 years of refinement. One winter, one river. Finished. Richard Hay moved to Cheltenham. He was in his late 40s. He had built 2 companies, refined one design philosophy across 3 decades, sat at a table with the 3 most consequential figures in British hi-fi, and watched a river take the physical evidence of all of it away from him. He was not finished. The relationship with the Hungarian manufacturer, the company that would eventually register itself as Heed Audio, had begun as an act of rescue. A small Central European electronics firm, technically capable and commercially alert, had recognized in the ion systems Obelisk range something worth preserving. A circuit architecture, a design philosophy, a way of balancing measured performance against musical character that was specifically and irreducibly British in origin, even if the factory producing it was no longer on British soil. He'd continued building the Obelisk. The name survived. The circuit survived in evolved form. The sound, that specific capacitor-coupled single-supply rail Class AB sound that Richard Hay had derived from Arthur Radford's valve philosophy and refined across 20 years of Bristol and Welsh manufacturing, survived in the hands of engineers in Hungary who had learned it from the man himself and who applied it with a seriousness that the audiophile community, which does not forgive shortcuts, found difficult to fault. But it was not ion systems. It was not Nytech. It was the continuation of a philosophy under different ownership, in a different country, by different hands. The distinction mattered. not as a criticism of Heed, whose commitment to the obelisk was genuine and whose amplifiers retained the essential character of Hay's original work, but as an honest accounting of what had been lost and what had been preserved. The design survived. The lineage did not. In 2012, Richard Hay came back to the British market one final time. The Bristol Show, the annual gathering of British hi-fi manufacturers and dealers, held each February in a hotel complex on the edge of the city, where Arthur Radford had built his first amplifier 66 years earlier, hosted Heed Audio in 2012. Hay was there, 67 years old, in failing health, working with Heed to establish UK distribution for the latest iteration of the Obelisk range, and to introduce British dealers and listeners to the amplifier that had outlived its original manufacturer, its original country of production, and 3 decades of changing audio fashion. The Obelisk Psi was priced at £1,090, 30 watts per channel, 5 inputs, upgradable with an outboard power supply. The essential architecture, Hay's architecture, Radford's philosophy. Translated and retranslated across 50 years of British and Central European engineering, still present in the circuit, still audible to anyone who had heard the original and retained the memory of what it sounded like. Richard Hay died on the 26th of October 2012, 8 months after the Bristol show, in a hospice in Cheltenham, the city where he had spent his final years. He was 67 years old. The Cardiff Revival. Nytech Audio Limited was registered at Companies House under company number 8481764. The registered address is 136 Croyce Road, Cardiff, South Wales. This is not Ion Systems. It is not the Chew Magna factory. It is not the Welsh operation that the river destroyed. It is a genuine British manufacturer, hand-building amplifiers and phonostages in South Wales, using Richard Hay's circuit principles as the foundation for a new range of products, keeping the name in production and the philosophy in practice. The CDP 132 phono preamplifier, reviewed in 2026 by dealers who stocked the original CTA 252 in the 1980s, was described as a continuation of what the brand had always represented, an honest, musical, specifically British approach to analog electronics. If someone asks whether Nytech survived, the honest answer is, the name survived. The company survived in a form. The philosophy survived in the products. What did not survive, what cannot be reconstituted by any registration at Companies House or any new product bearing the original badge, is the specific community of practice that Richard Hay built and rebuilt across 50 years. The trained ears, the institutional memory, the lineage from Arthur Radford's Bristol Transformer Workshop to Chew Magna to Newtown Powys. That lineage ended in a flood in the early 1990s in a Welsh market town beside a river that did not know or care what it was destroying. If someone asks whether it is still worth visiting the Cardiff operation, acquiring a new Nytech product, investing in what the name now represents, the answer is also honest, yes, because the alternative is silence, and silence is not a philosophy. The collector's verdict. If someone asks whether the original still matters, the collector market has already answered. A Nytech CTA 252 XD, in working condition, the extended definition version, with the dealer changeable phono card, and the toroidal transformer upgrade of the XDII, sells on the British secondary market for between £150 and £400, depending on condition, service history, and the presence of original documentation. For an amplifier that retailed at £300 in 1980, this represents not merely inflation survival, but genuine appreciation in real terms. In a category of consumer electronics, where the overwhelming majority of products depreciate to near zero within a decade of manufacture, the CPA 602 power amplifier commands more. It is harder to find, more keenly sought, and held by owners who regard it with the specific possessiveness of people who have heard what it does and calculated that nothing available at a comparable price does the same thing. Online communities. The British hi-fi forums, the vintage audio groups, the Pinkfish media threads that run to hundreds of pages contain extended, technically detailed, personally passionate discussions of Nytech and Ion Systems equipment that have been active for 20 years and show no sign of concluding. Owners post restoration notes, service logs, circuit modifications, comparative listening impressions. A man in Scotland describes running a CTA 252XD in a second system with Rega speakers, still working, needing a bulb, sounding exactly as it sounded when he bought it 30 years ago. If someone asks whether it was irreplaceable, the secondary market has given its answer. It is the only answer that cannot be argued with. What the original still does. The specific reason the original Nytech cannot be substituted by modern budget amplification for certain purposes is not sentimental. It is technical. The capacitor-coupled output topology that Richard Hay derived from his Radford experience, Class AB push-pull, single supply rail, circuit designed to reach 15 Hz with less than 1 decibel of insertion loss, produces a specific interaction between the amplifier's output stage and the loudspeaker load that modern budget designs, almost universally built around integrated circuit amplifier modules or Class D switching architectures, do not replicate. The difference is audible in the bass register, in the way the circuit handles the boundary between what can be heard and what can be felt. The low frequencies that a well-recorded double bass or kick drum produces below the threshold of the amplifier's comfortable operating range. Session musicians and dedicated listeners who work with original Nytech equipment describe this not as coloration, not as the amplifier adding something that was not in the recording, but as the absence of a specific truncation that cheaper designs impose. The music reaches further down. The room pressurizes differently. The physical experience of listening changes in a way that measurements alone do not predict and cannot fully explain. This was what Richard Hay was trying to achieve in 1972. It was what Arthur Radford had been trying to achieve in 1946. The problem they were both solving. How do you translate the full information in a recording into physical sound in a room, without losing the lowest frequencies, without hardening the mid-range, without making the treble into something that a listener's ear registers as fatigue rather than detail, is the same problem. The tools changed. The goal did not. If someone asks what remains, if someone asks whether it was irreplaceable, the secondary market has already answered. What remains at the factory addresses is less easily answered. The Chew Magna site, the village outside Bristol, where Richard Hay built his first calculator-shaped amplifier prototype from balsa wood in the early 1970s, is a Somerset village. It was never primarily an industrial address. The factory presence was always modest. What stands there now is what always stood there, minus one small workshop that briefly mattered enormously to a specific community of British listeners. Newtown Powys received its new flood defenses years after the Ion Systems closure. The town has a bypass now. The River Severn has been managed in the way that rivers in Wales are managed, with respect, with caution, with the knowledge that management is not the same as control. The ground where the Ion Systems factory stood has been put to other uses. Nothing marks it. What it reveals, if someone asks whether it was irreplaceable, the secondary market has given its verdict. What the Nytech story reveals, held alongside the Armstrong story and the Leak story and the Quad story and the dozens of other British hi-fi episodes that share its essential shape, is something about the specific fragility of the lineage model, the model in which knowledge passes from master to apprentice, from workshop to workshop, from one generation of engineers to the next, through proximity and practice, rather than documentation and process. Arthur Radford to Richard Hay to Dave Allner and Paul Hamblin and Keith Abbott, and the small teams that built the CTA 252 and the CA 252 and the CPA 602 and the Obelisk. That chain of transmission produced something genuinely excellent. It also produced something genuinely fragile, a body of knowledge that lived in people, not in documents, and that a flood could interrupt in ways that no corporate acquisition and no government policy could quite replicate. Britain has lost its instrument makers and its amplifier makers and its speaker makers in many ways. Japanese competition, corporate mismanagement, Thatcherite deindustrialization, the hollow revival, the brand name that survives its manufacturing soul by decades. These are the standard forces, the documented mechanisms, the villains that the history books have learned to name. But sometimes Britain loses things in a quieter way. A river rises, a factory floods, a man moves to Cheltenham. The institutional memory disperses into the people who carry it. And those people age, and eventually the knowledge lives only in the machines themselves, in the 40-year-old CTA 252 still playing records in a Scottish spare room, in the CPA 602 whose output stage was designed in a Bristol workshop that no longer exists, in the circuit that runs, still, like a valve design executed in solid state, carrying the specific electrical grammar of a tradition that stretched from 1946 to a flood in Powys, and then further still, in diminished and altered form, to a hospice in Cheltenham in October 2012. What if someone asks whether it was irreplaceable? The secondary market has answered. The circuit has answered. The 40-year-old amplifier, still working, still musical, still doing what it was designed to do in a room in Britain, has answered. The man who designed it cannot. Final image. Somewhere in Britain tonight, in a spare room in Scotland, or a listening room in Sheffield, or a flat in Bristol, not far from where Arthur Radford built his first amplifier in 1946, a Nytech CTA 252 is powered on. The panel meters catch the light behind their Perspex window. The FM tuner, which audiophiles who cared specifically about radio reception once described as among the finest available at any price, finds its frequency. The capacitor-coupled output stage, running Class AB from a single supply rail, settles into the specific electrical relationship with the loudspeaker that Richard Hay spent 3 years in Arthur Radford's workshop learning to hear, and the rest of his life learning to replicate without the valves. The record starts. The room changes. The bass reaches the frequency that cheaper amplifiers do not reach. The mid-range carries the detail that measurement-first design does not prioritize. The sound is in the room, fully dimensionally, with the specific quality that its designer called musical, and that the people who owned it, and kept it for 40 years, and refused to replace it with something more modern, always recognized as the thing they had been looking for when they walked into a dealer's listening room in Britain in 1978, and sat down and heard something they had not expected to hear. The factory in Chew Magna is a Somerset village again. The factory in Newtown is whatever the ground uses now. Arthur Radford is gone. Richard Hay is gone. Ion Systems is gone. The sound is here, still here, in this room, in this machine, made in England. The stories this channel tells are all, in their different ways, the same story of what Britain made and what Britain lost, and the specific, irreplaceable distance between those two facts. Next, we turn to another chapter in that story. We'll see you in the next one.